The FBI literally has in its possession one piece of evidence that could literally solve the D.B. Cooper mystery. What is it and where is it? Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Ulis here. All right, let's talk about this one piece of evidence that I believe that the FBI actually possesses right now today that actually has the ability to solve the D.B. Cooper case. Now, what I'm talking about is a piece of evidence that is actually rarely talked about, and it seems to be often overlooked. And that is a piece of hair, a strand of hair, apparently from D.B. Cooper's head, that was found on the towel that is affixed to the chair that was on the airliner that D.B. Cooper flew on. When the jet arrived in Reno, that towel that sits on the chair back there behind you, they pulled that off and they noticed that there was a hair, apparently a black strand of hair there that apparently came from D.B. Cooper's head, which they submitted to Quantico in Virginia. They looked at it and they actually said there are some identifiable characteristics related to this strand of hair. Now, obviously, this is the early 70s, so this is, before the advent of DNA testing. So they weren't thinking in terms of DNA back then, but we should be thinking in terms of DNA today. Now, oftentimes, there's a lot of discussion around these cigarette butts, these 8 cigarette butts that came from the ashtray at D.B. Cooper's chair because, as we all know, D.B. Cooper smoked cigarettes on the jet. Now, the cigarette butts as well could have been an ideal source of D.B. Cooper's DNA. However, the cigarette butts were destroyed. They were destroyed on purpose by the FBI after they were analyzed at Quantico. They were looking for fingerprints, things of that nature. Again, no DNA back then, 1971, 1972. Now, I often hear people say that the cigarette butts are lost, but they weren't lost. They were actually destroyed. What's interesting to note, however, is that in addition to the 8 cigarette butts being submitted to Quantico, there was also this strand of hair that was submitted to Quantico. And that strand of hair was placed in a glass microscope slide, and it was obviously viewed underneath a microscope. Now, both of these items, meaning the cigarette butts as well as the strand of hair, were to be sent back to Las Vegas because that's the field office that apparently these items came from, because again, these items were collected in Reno, Nevada. Now, the interesting thing is that the hair never arrived. This strand of hair apparently never arrived back in Las Vegas. Now, the cigarette butts apparently did arrive back in Las Vegas and were destroyed in Las Vegas. There's FBI documentation to that effect. The strand of hair, however, it's just gone missing. Now, in later years, the FBI actually did inquire of their Los Angeles office to see if perhaps the strand of hair in the glass slide happened to end up in LA, but apparently that's not where it ended up. Apparently they found nothing because it's still missing as of today. So even though the cigarette butts didn't actually go missing, they were purposely destroyed, that strand of hair apparently did actually go missing. Now, I do not believe that the strand of hair was destroyed because in the FBI documentation, it clearly states that if there are hairs that the authorities want to compare to this particular strand of hair, the Quantico office essentially tells the FBI office, apparently Las Vegas office, to just send the slide back to them for the purposes of comparing to other hair from individuals. So we can be assured that they didn't destroy that strand of hair. Also, it was placed within, again, a glass slide, a glass microscope slide. So it's one thing to throw out the cigarette butts and burn those or destroy them or what have you, but given that the strand of hair was actually placed in the slide, it seems really unlikely that somebody would have thrown that away. It's not that the strand of hair was just simply sitting in a small plastic Ziploc bag or something like that, and somebody just made a mistake. This was actually in a glass slide, so you would think that this is something that they wouldn't have thrown away. But again, importantly, apparently it never showed back up in Vegas. So what I suspect happened is that the hair actually never left Quantico. I suspect it's still sitting there in Quantico in Virginia. It's hard to explain how that happens, but I think that the most rational explanation probably relates to the fact that they understood, that is Quantico understood, that the item may be coming back to them at some point in the future for the purposes of trying to effect some sort of comparison to, some other hair. And there may have been a situation that for whatever reason, the slide just stayed in Quantico and never made its way back to Vegas. I mean, this is what we know. What we know is that it was obviously analyzed and observed in Quantico, and we've got documentation to that effect. We also have documentation saying that the stuff is going to be sent back to Las Vegas. The strand of hair is going to be sent back to Las Vegas, as well as some additional items and so forth. We also know that apparently it had never arrived in Las Vegas. So the last confirmed sighting of the strand of hair apparently was Quantico. So in my diseased mind, if I'm looking for this strand of hair, I'm not going to be looking at Vegas, even though apparently they did look in Vegas. I'm not going to be looking in LA, even though apparently they did look in LA. I'm going to be starting out and looking at the spot, the place that the last confirmed sighting was, which was Quantico. So I have reached out to the FBI and said as much, that I think the hair is still sitting there in Quantico in all likelihood. So hopefully somebody does something about that and they take my correspondence seriously and they look for this thing. Because if they can find that strand of hair, that may well serve as the holy grail in terms of the D.B. Cooper case. Because that hair has been protected in a glass slide, and there's a very strong possibility that they're going to be able to pull a very solid DNA profile from that strand of hair from D.B. Cooper. And we all know what that could mean for the case. All right, folks, that's it. That's what I've got for you today. Again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, cheers.